a bonus episode to celebrate the new year. This podcast episode is an original tale by Spindleshanks McScrew of the Yorkshire Ghost Tours and is quite unnerving. Listener discretion is advised. Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows.
Otley's iconic Jubilee Clock Tower was first built in the year 1887 to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. What she'd do with a big old clock in the middle of a market town in West Yorkshire is beyond me, but it's a nice bit of decor, even if it does usually run 2 minutes fast. The Jubilee clock has always run 2 minutes ahead of time. The clock is frequently adjusted and good care is taken over it as a key feature of the town, and twice a year, of course, the clock face is wound an hour forward, then backwards, for the first day or so. After this amendment, the clock will show the correct time, but before long, it will revert back to its age-old habit and settle into ticking 2 minutes too quickly, as that is where it is most comfortable. Now, I actually found out recently that it's illegal for a public clock to show the wrong time, but there's not much that can be done for our Jubilee clock because it's quite stubborn. Now, there's some suggested reasoning behind our stubborn clock tower. It comes in the form of a story involving the race against time, a small town turf war, and a rather punctual young lad. 10-year-old Jack Murphy resided in Otley in the late 1800s. He had a large family, and they lived on Otley's East End, near to what was then and is still referred to now as the Irish Fields. It was no secret in the town that there was a rivalry between the kids living on the east of Otley with some rather offensive little brutes who lived across the river on the west. The marketplace was home to regularly scheduled scraps between each party, which would normally degenerate into town-spread, booze-fueled chaos between the next generation and the generation after that sometimes. It was late December, and there was a sense of peace, for once, between East and West. Not a peep had been heard since Christmas Eve, and all caught up in goodwill, young Jack Murphy decided that this was the year he would put a stop to the fighting and unite both sides of Otley as one. This was largely mocked by the older kids on both sides. Jack decided to approach George, the toughest, meanest, oldest boy from the Western estate, to request a peace treaty. In a rare match of conscientiousness, the two gangs sat together and discussed their plan. It might be added here that none of these lads went to school, so they had plenty of time on their hands. Jack himself sat in on this meeting, of course, and signed the agreement in the end. The duel was agreed. Well, it wasn't much of a duel, it was all Jack's work, really. He was to run from the Jubilee clock to the top of the Chevin in 30 minutes or under. They were to meet promptly at 4:55 that evening, and he was to set off at 5. By nature, it was a challenge both physically and mentally, but if he succeeded, the peace treaty between both sides of Otley would be signed. A large crowd of children from both sides of the town formed that evening at the Jubilee clock, and Jack, encouraged by his Irish family and friends, donned his running shoes and set his watch. "Wait!" George stepped forward, and the crowd hushed into silence. "We never set out about a watch, that's cheating." Hollering from both sides immediately ensued, and a fight very nearly broke out there and then, until Jack shouted above it, "It's fine, I'll leave my watch behind. I doubt I'll need it anyway, it was just a pacemaker." A roaring cheer was set off by the Irish, and Jack was ready to go. The gun was fired into the air, and he was off. It was a clear set rule that he was not to be followed by anyone up the hill itself, but a crowd followed his run to the base of the Chevin, cheering him on. Jack's battle against the Chevin was brave and impressively short-lived. He was a runner by nature, and despite his small stature, strode his way up the looming slope until he was at the very top. He slapped the hand of the two girls who waited for him at Surprise View, one from each side to keep things fair, who promptly set off a single firework from the top of the hill to mark his arrival. The Irish located at the bottom of the Chevin cheered at the sight of the firework. He was 17 minutes in. Providing he could shave off 2 minutes on the run back down, he was in for a win, and they suspected he'd manage that. Jack pelted his way down the Chevin and ran back from its base with his entourage, sprinting his way back to the Jubilee Clock. He slapped the hands of the two lads stationed there, and the buttons of 2 stopwatches were pushed. He had made it in under 30 minutes, with 12 seconds to spare. 29:48, an impressive time. Cheers and roars erupted from the Irish, who hiked Jack up onto their shoulders and hollered at his win. They didn't see the smug grins and the shaking heads between those of the Western gang. George stepped forwards. An impressive time, son, but cheating wasn't on the cards. "Who the hell are you calling a cheat?" Jack piped up, fuming. "You were to leave at 5 p.m. on the dot. Look at that, you came in 2 minutes late." George nodded up to the Jubilee clock face. Indeed, it was 3 minutes past. The fight that had taken place prior to his departure had stalled him for time. "That's not fair, he was timed to run from the trigger," one lad shouted. George pulled out the contract to show how it clearly stated Jack was to run from 5 p.m. The gunshot was a mere formality. The boy with the stopwatch then produced his time. Having set off at 5 p.m, Jack was 2 minutes late. "But you started the fight in the first place. These were your dirty tactics." Otley's East accused the West of applying illegal tactics and loopholes. The West shouted about the importance of punctuality. Both accused the other side of starting the fight in the first place. Before things got too gory, Jack stepped forward once more. "Let's make another deal. I'll run up the bloody hill again if I must. Let's play it again, fair and square this time." "He thinks we want to wait around all night while he runs up and down the hill," yelled George. "No, I have a better idea. If you really want us to stop coming to your ends, harassing you and your lot, throwing rocks at your little uns and aiming catapults at your oldies, if it's civility you're really after, you're going to have to work for it." He pointed at Jack. "You must spend 24 hours in there." He pointed to the clock tower. It had a tiny wooden door at the bottom, and it didn't look very comfortable. The group of kids looked at Jack in trepidation and confusion. Jack set his eyes on the door. "How do I get in?" George stepped forwards with his penknife and set about attempting to pick the lock. Within a few minutes the door was open, and the children gathered round to stare into Jack's home for the night. Jack gulped. 24 hours. The space was gloomy, dusty, and extremely slim, and that was with the door open. Jack wasn't a lover of confined spaces, and he could have done with a nice gallon of ale and a sit-down after his run up and down the Chevin, but he reminded himself of the worth of the task and of the bruises his nanny had suffered at the Westerners' catapults. Deal. Jack and George shook on it, and Jack took a step into the small space. The Irish whispered notes of encouragement as they patted him forwards and shook his hand. By this point they were perhaps a bit embarrassed by the bravery of the young lad against their own, but there was no way of any of them could even fit in the tower, let alone wait it out for a day and a night. George grinned at Jack with morbid delight before slamming the door in the young lad's face. Poor Jack found himself immersed in darkness, the walls closing in on him. He had no choice but to stand. The walls were deep set, and he had not enough room to seat himself on the floor as he so desired. 24 hours left. How would he last? His eyes adjusted to the inky black as the claustrophobia began to build. The bell tower down the road chimed 6, and all of a sudden, Jack found himself frenzied. He beat his fists against the small wooden door, shouting and screaming for someone to release him, but to no avail. The solitary tower stood alone in the marketplace. All the children had left for tea. Jack crumpled, leaning against the door. He could just about make out the tears as they dropped to the grit by his feet. He had no coat, and the warmth he had felt from his run had long since evaporated. He blew out a puff of visible breath and considered that he might freeze to death before his time was through. Jack lowered himself into a half squat and closed his eyes, meditating on the events that had unfolded that day and throughout his time in this godforsaken little town. As he reflected, rage pent up inside him. The twisted game, the evil brutes from the Western estate, the tragic and ridiculous circumstances that wound him up in this depraved little valley in the first place, the British government, the British public, the lengths he would go to protect his own, and still, after all the rule following, all the good-natured civility he had shown, those in charge found a way to warp the laws towards their favour once again. 2 minutes. The bell began to chime. 2 measly minutes. Jack spoke aloud from his cell. He looked up to the clock face, which shone gold from the street lighting and lit the tower. He stared at the mirrored faces reflecting 7 p.m. to one another. The final ring of 7 echoed through the town, reverberating and never ending. The clock maintained its perfect timing. Jack sprang to his feet. 7 p.m. my arse, he shouted up to unperturbed faces. Jack glared at the clock faces, who responded with a single tick forwards, or backwards as he saw it. His attention was caught by the machinery in the centre top of the tower, constantly whirring, ticking, moving. He didn't understand it, but he wanted to look closer. As did he relate to the machinery, the need to consistently move to keep his own system running through the bitter cold of night was becoming all the more critical. The only way was up. Jack spread his arms across the base of the building. His fingertips just grazed the stone. He gave a little hop and kicked out his right leg to touch the wall, aiming to reach out his left hand to catch himself halfway. His left hand didn't quite make it and he slipped backwards, catching his back painfully on the wall behind him and dragging it back to the ground, where he fell in a heap. Determined to reach the mysterious machinery at the top of the clock and possibly even get a look out into the night from one of the faces, Jack stood up and tried again. He jumped up, gripping the walls with his hands and the sides of his feet. He almost slipped again, but shuffled himself upwards until he found he was comfortably wedged between the walls. From here, he shuffled himself upwards to the top of the tower. As he approached the underneath of the whirring machinery, it appeared Jack had met a dead end. He looked in awe at the jolting, spinning cogs from underneath them, and the wooden, consistent ticking reverberated through the top of his skull to the ends of his chilled toes. Momentarily snatched from the clockwork's captivation, Jack noticed a gap between the machinery and the easterly facing clock face. He pulled himself through the gap and gazed out of the opaque yellow window. He could just about make out the figures of 3 drunkards hobbling out from the opposing pub, laughing and pushing each other in their merriment. Jack hit his hand against the rough glass and shouted out to them across the square. "Help me!" No luck. The trio hobbled away and their shouts died out into the night. Jack turned around and leant his back against the clock face to watch the machinery again. He found a comfortable enough position on a ledge and was able to sit to watch the whirring bits of brass and wood push themselves around, working into the dark hours. As he watched, he tried to imagine the thing at the centre of the cogs. How did this thing work? He imagined a small man at its centre, pushing and probing and never tiring from his infinite calling. And for what cause? To be mocked by those unscrupulous Westerners, to have his time warped and twisted and unlawfully pulled around. The more Jack dwelled upon the facts of time, the more slanted he felt that he had been from his running match. 2 minutes of fighting, 2 decades of fighting, it had been too many. It was an intuitive task. The clock was no longer a mystery for him. The machine that had only previously been baffling was now something he would fix and mend using only pure logic. He pushed and twisted and found exactly the piece he needed to fix this whole mess, and, after only a minute's work, the clock had been set back 2 minutes, and now displayed a calm 7:18 on all 4 of its faces. Satisfied with his work, the small boy turned around once again to face the marketplace, smugly looking out onto the town through the newly adjusted clock face. That'll teach the people of Otley, he thought. Now they'd always be 2 minutes early, or think they're 2 minutes late for everything. Good. Maybe they'll become more punctual and their manners will improve. It was on this thought that he felt a cold thrust hit his back, and what he assumed to be a piece of jagged machinery, but what felt like a wretched claw clutch onto his shoulder and pull him backwards. He hung, suspended in the air at the top of the tower, screaming out loud as he looked down past his swinging legs and to the grit on the ground far beneath him. "I'm sorry," he shouted. "I shouldn't have messed with it. I'll change it back. I'll change it back." The boy turned his head left and right, dead certain that there was a person at fault for this. Perhaps another of the Westerners had broken in, were at the crux of this mean trick. He turned his head so violently then that he felt a snap in his neck, and a cruel, haggard face grinned back at him. Jack froze in his shock, and not a sound escaped his lips as the miniature beast released him and the poor boy fell to the ground. Jack's body fell into a crumpled heap, neck snapped and a face white with shock. This was where he spent the rest of the night and was found the next day by the Otley children. The kids of Otley were punished to a life of suffering regret by the tragedy they had caused. The clock tower, a chilling reminder of the events of that day. One chilling phenomenon gripped many of them, and though the tale was not regularly discussed, a few of them privately agreed having witnessed the same thing. On the opening of the small wooden door, before even having noticed poor Jack's crumpled little body, something had left the tower. Something dark grey and smoke-like. It gave off a dusty, metallic aroma, and 1 or 2 of the children reported feeling a grisly thing brush past their shoulder as they watched it leave. One thing that they had all agreed upon was the strange fact of the clock tower running itself 2 minutes late after Jack's death, which a few of them had linked back to his Chevin climb. Another odd coincidence was the chiming of the parish churchyard clock, which perfectly matched the timing of the Jubilee Tower. Many of them fantasised about Jack's having something to do with this too, as he had been buried in the easterly part of the cemetery. Leaving the Black Bull pub in the early hours of New Year's morning with her father, one young girl gripped his sleeve as she looked up at the Jubilee clock just as it hit 1. Young Jacqueline swore she saw a face looking back at her, but she was promptly taken home and read a calming bedtime story to replace the fright. Thank you all for listening. I have been Spindleshanks McScrew with the Bell Witch podcast. For more gory, grisly tales about Otley, do book on to the Otley Ghost Tour. And for more local haunts, we have the Leeds Ghost Tour and the Skipton Ghost Tour as well. I wish you all a very happy 2026, and I hope it's filled with lots of haunts and frights and terrors. It will be if you keep listening to the Bell Witch podcast. Goodbye.